So you were just in last year. It was fascinating watching the film upstairs, and we're looking forward to seeing the entire series. Someone who's covered crime and justice and legal affairs for quite some time now, there's so many questions that pop up in my head, and so it's fantastic to speak to you about that, about what the film kind of conveyed. So what I wanted to ask you first of all is, what's interesting is that the whole private investigation that was done for this, it's something that, in India, this entire conversation about who's guilty, what is the kind of criminal justice we provide, what is the culpability that a witness has, is something that's really relevant right now. In Parliament, they've just passed another amendment to a terror law, made it tougher, and they're talking of right now they can brand, before they could only brand organizations as terrorist organizations. Now they are looking, the whole conversation is about branding individuals as terrorists, and at what stage do you brand them as terrorists? When they are being just, the accusation has come in, or do you wait for conviction or not? And they're saying that, as soon as, sometimes it's not possible to even have them in custody. Even before that, the government can brand people as terrorists. And what's interesting is that while you have the race question in America, which this film showed as well, how minorities are targeted, it's a similar kind of question in India as well, where you're talking about a lot of the people who are facing terror charges in prison are minorities. They're Muslims in India. So this is a common conversation, which is perhaps universal, these questions across the world. What I wanted to ask you was, does the state prosecution or the defense, do they fail to provide the right kind of backing? I mean, did it take journalists turned investigators to find out the truth about Meek's case?
That some people, is this working? Yes. It's sometimes said that in the United States, you're better off to be rich and guilty than innocent and poor, because the system swallows up those people who are unable or don't have the resources properly to defend themselves. In the case of Meek, when it took 7 months for his family to raise the $5,000 that was required to get him out on bail when he was initially arrested. And then he faced trial, and he opted for a bench trial. In other words, not a jury, but he opted to leave the decision in the hands of the judge alone. Why did he do that? Because it was much cheaper. And so everything, all the way down the line in the American justice system, and it may also be the case here, is if you don't have the resources, you're almost defenseless up to a certain degree. And yes, we have in our system, one of the joys of being a journalist, I think, is that you get the opportunity, hopefully, to call those in power to account when things aren't done properly. And as I've discovered in my new role as a private investigator, we also have that opportunity to call the system out, which is what happened in this case. And for those of you who don't know, the story of Meek Mill, which began when he was arrested in 2007, actually ended 8 days ago when the three judges on a panel in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned his conviction, finally, citing the evidence that we at QRI dug up on his behalf. So his entire adult life has been entangled in this unfair system. There are a little over 2 million people behind bars in the United States, but there are nearly 5 million people who are in the probation system. And in the case of Meek, and in cases of many people in the probation system, they're entirely at the mercy of one person, and that's the judge who put them there behind bars in the first place and put them on probation in the first place. So even if the prosecution thinks that Meek Mill should not have been in prison, it doesn't matter if the judge does. And you can violate your probation in ways that are kind of mind-boggling. He broke it once because there was a picture released in a swimming pool with an inflatable gun. It was a swimming pool toy, but it was an inflatable gun. And she threw the book at him for that. You can actually be put back in jail if you're on probation in the United States for jaywalking and not having a job. So, you're out of luck if you don't have the resources to fight your case. And of course, Meek's case is a little bit special because he had some very rich and powerful friends, notably JayZ, who was our client in this case, and Rock Nation. Now, if Meek had been someone else, he would still be in prison almost certainly. Wow. So,
you talk about, did you say $5,000 in bail?
When he was first arrested and put behind bars, the bail, I believe, was either $5,000 or $7,000. It took the family more than 6 months to raise it.
So I'll tell you, just to kind of point out to people the kind of similarities of the system, that there are people who just stay in jail because they can't put up 500 rupees bail amount in India. 500 rupees. That's it. That's what? How many dollars is that? Yeah, $10. So that's the kind of system. And you're exactly right. So which is why I think watching this film, it is such a universal thing, because the criminal justice system is the same everywhere. And what's happening is, what's needed is that for people to point this out. The only thing is, who is the person calling this out? What's interesting, what I found interesting also about the film was that once it got called out, you called out the fact that they put in a police officer who was supposed to be investigating. They didn't make him a witness because he would have outed them and said that, he didn't actually point the gun at them. But there was a police officer who you all found. What's interesting about this is that, there are so many people like that. What made you become from a journalist into a private investigator? Is it because, like you said, you wanted to call out people in a more active manner, that writing wasn't doing that anymore?
Well, the answer as to why I left journalism could take up the rest of this session, so I'll try and keep it short. Actually, I just said that, one of the joys of journalism is it gives you the opportunity to call people in power to account. And I think I understood that as in private investigating, we would have some of the same ability and the same sort of sense of mission. And I was just very fortunate that I ended up at my company, QRI, where the leaders of the company have a very clear sort of ethical, moral, and political compass. And we do a lot of work in the public interest. I'm currently working on one very big Me Too case. I'm working on two big prison exoneration cases, both involving people who were behind bars for decades for crimes they didn't do. We do a lot of work with the Innocence Project.
Right. And it's funded by?
In this case, it was funded by Rock Nation and JayZ. And in other cases, sometimes it's funded by not-for-profit organizations, or it's funded by lawyers who are bringing suit against the state for abuse of people who've been wrongfully incarcerated. So it's a variety of people, and we charge on a kind of sliding scale. You won't be surprised that since the client in this case was JayZ and Rock Nation, we didn't do it pro bono. But that's an interesting thing too. So the answer is, I discovered almost by accident that in an private investigative company, I was able to do not just what I was doing as a journalist, but actually, because of the resources they have, I was able to do more. And I feel I'm actually being more effective. I mean, I can't tell you how satisfying it is to watch that show today and know that that man is now out of jail, and know that he is now using his freedom to try and shine a light on everything. He has now started something called the Reform Alliance with JayZ, which will focus precisely on what we're talking about here. And they've already taken us on, QRI, as a kind of in-house investigator to investigate other cases like Meek. So it's wonderful that the things that I loved about journalism, feeling that you're doing something important, I can continue that in this new circumstance. One other thing I'd say, which is kind of interesting, is we all know that money isn't available for journalists when we need it very often. And what's interesting about a company like QRI is that we're bringing private money to bear on these kinds of issues. So the money in this case is coming from JayZ. We had all the funding we needed. I mean, you can tell from that one episode, it was a very detailed, very painstaking. We flew to Orlando, we flew to the Caribbean where the judge had some property up and down the East Coast. We found all these documents. It was 6 months of intense work for about 8 people, so it's expensive. There aren't that many journalistic organizations that would have that kind of cash. So that's interesting also that through companies like this, we can bring private money in to resolve these civil society issues more effectively.
And that just kind of makes me wonder, will we over here ever have that kind of a system that people are doing that? I think there are lawyers. There are many lawyers who have taken this up upon themselves. For example, the whole case of Shahid. A film was made on Shahid, which was, well, that wasn't a documentary, but it's a real life person, Shahid Choudhury, who would take up cases of people who were wrongfully charged and then fight for them. And he became so effective that he was assassinated as well. So there's a case of that. But these are individual instances of people taking up the cause of those that have been wrongfully charged. And that's what David's talking about as well. I think these films as well, because, the problem is that all of these people are languishing in jails. And I think they're languishing in the prisons of America as well. You have so many, for all the people, there's so much talk about, like, Free Meek has been successful. And there are, of course, other cases as well, like the one, the Central Park Five.
Yes.
And, I've been, hearing news about the other case, I forget his name right now, who was wrongfully killed because of the chokehold that the police officers used. That case
in New York City, yes.
Right. So there's been so much discussion about it. There's discussion in India as well. However, while what you saw in the film was that as soon as a police officer is found as dodgy, they instantly look at what are the cases that police officer probed in order to go and relook that. I don't think that kind of accountability is happening over here. Police officers, for example, the Mumbai encounter police officers, then there are instances later on where they've been found to be corrupt. But nobody then goes back and says there's no accountability of saying, okay, if this person is found to be guilty right now, because they were made heroes before, if this person is dodgy, should I look at the people that he put behind bars and see what is the basis of their investigation? So is it a new thing, David, that people have started questioning, or is it up to the defense attorneys to then go and say, look, this person has found to be really, really suspicious. He's a corrupt officer. You need to look at my client's case again. Where does the onus lie?
Well, increasingly, jurisdictions are getting much more proactive about doing exactly what you're saying, that if they discover there's been a corrupt cop or cops or a corrupt prosecutor, if there's any suggestion of the system having broken down, this is the case in Boston, where an enormous number of convictions are now currently under review. It's an expensive business, but of course it has to be done. But even before the cities, the reason why they do that is because, not necessarily because they're civic-minded and they want to sleep better at night, but, well, hopefully that's why, but it's also because those people who've been convicted will sue. They will find lawyers who will sue on their behalf, and when that kind of thing is on paper, when Philadelphia publishes that list of cops that they were too afraid to bring to the stand because they knew they were rotten, they know that anybody who was thrown in jail because of the work of those police will sue the city, and that is what happens. And we are working on several cases in New York we're normally hired by the lawyers, not by which is an important thing we could discuss later if you like, or I have another session this afternoon talking about all of these issues. But yes, it opens, and I don't know why that wouldn't be the case in India, but you can see that, as soon as there's evidence of a possibility of wrongful conviction, the person who's being convicted is going to go running to their nearest lawyer as fast as they can, as they should.
No, it is there in India. But the thing is that the money is very little. And it never, it's very little. I think that one of the things that, as journalists, we keep going back to people. We keep hearing these horrendous stories. There's one case that I documented myself of this young person who was an English teacher, and he's now almost blind because of the torture that he received in prison. And after spending more than a decade in jail, he came out. So he runs what's called the Innocence Network. And they're basically trying to raise awareness about it. But that's where it is.
Yes.
They say that they deserve compensation, but the state is not yet at that stage where they are giving. The courts are not. Very rare cases. NHRC, when the Human Rights, the Human Rights Commission gets involved over here, in rare cases they've said, okay, this person, either they put away that officer, which has happened when it's led to an extreme case like death. It does happen that the police officers get punished, rarely though. But in a case like the one that I'm mentioning, in his case, because he came out alive, so, it's not brutal enough. Even though he's going blind right now, he's literally losing his vision because of the kind of torture that he received.
Yeah.
But it's not something tangible that the state can give you compensation for.
Because they don't want to.
They don't want to, yeah.
But that's why these conversations, I think, sorry, excuse me.
No,
that's
please.
why these conversations are so important, and why programs like the one we just saw upstairs are so important, because it incentivizes and activates those people in society. I mean, normally the people who get help usually get help from not-for-profit organizations like Innocence that you just mentioned. Yeah. I'm working on a case right now of a man who was tortured overseas, and I can't tell you anything more about it, but the reason that his case came to us was, again, because a private institution that is committed to fighting torture around the world got the money together for him to get the lawyer and put his case. And this is a case against a national leader. But it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for civil society being concerned. And this means that we have to activate people with money like JayZ. There are a lot of wealthy people out there, philanthropists, who, if we can just get their attention, would want to help. And they contribute to organizations like the one you mentioned and the torture institution I mentioned in the US. So the more we talk about these things, the more we report about these things, hopefully the more people will pay attention and the resources will go in the places they need to go to help people like your friend.
Yeah.
Or the person you met, who's going
sure.
blind.
But I think that, wouldn't you say that JayZ got involved because Meek was a rapper himself, and so comes from the community. I think that, if it became someone, if tomorrow, for instance, our big star, like Shah Rukh Khan, something happened to someone he knows, someone who works for him, then they would get involved. Otherwise...
Well, that's completely true. I mean, the way things happened in the case of Meek is that JayZ and other supporters of Meek, Michael Rubin, who owns the 76ers, a big team in Philadelphia, Robert Kraft, who owns the New England Patriot baseball team. These are all rich men who hired us to try and get Meek out of prison. Interestingly, we were 3/4 of the way through the investigation when they asked Amazon to make a documentary film about it. Why did they do that? Because they want to make Meek into a star. Sadly...
Commercial interests, yeah.
So often, yes, if you can get commercial interests and conscience to collide, then you're doing well. That's the magic formula.
Really smart entrepreneurs have to meet humanitarians and have to meet civil lawyers, basically, who fight for this. Because there are enough lawyers who are doing that. I think there are enough law students. And I think so much of the kind of reopening of cases, or even the DNA, I think there's a DNA matching system, which is there in the US, which has also led to many convictions being overturned. Am I right?
Absolutely. And cold cases, we are at the moment negotiating with... a network. We're hoping to start a series of cold case investigations that will feature us investigating cases that have not been solved. And our first case is of the murder of 4 teenage girls in a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. In 1992, they were aged 14, 15, 17, and 17. They were shot, raped, and burned to death in a yogurt shop. It has never been solved, but we now know how to get to the DNA. So we hope that we'll soon be starting that project. These families have had no resolution all these years. We think we can solve what the police have failed to solve. Again, a police department that's riven with corruption. I'm going to get sued if I'm not careful. But yeah, DNA has proven, as you know, to be the Innocence Project is very large and a huge institution in the U.S. and has been enormously influential in exoneration cases. And it's I think all of their cases arise out of the new DNA technology.
Talk to us a little bit more about the funding, which you were saying, David, about how you all were hired, by basically the defense lawyers. And here the defense lawyers happen to be people who knew influential people. But otherwise, is it possible for, otherwise would it work? Or what are the other cases that a firm like yours takes up? Well,
it's a very interesting question. I would say that the majority of our cases we're hired by law firms who have a financial interest in winning their cases, obviously, because often they do it on contingency. They need to win the case to be paid, and they just make the calculation that hiring us makes it more likely they'll win their case, so they'll pay us on the assumption that they will get a big payout. I mean, I've worked on countless cases where mostly to do with corporate malfeasance, healthcare companies, banking companies, retail companies, where there has been a large class action lawsuit pending, and the law firm that is representing the plaintiffs in the class action lawsuit come to us because they expect to get a multi-million-dollar payout at the end of it. So if they pay us $250,000 to investigate their case, and we help them build the case, that's good value for them. Seems like a lot of money to me, but sometimes these cases result in, $50,000, $100,000 verdicts.
And there's one question that I kept thinking about it I'll go back to the case I was talking about, this man who got wrongfully charged. There's one question that he asked of me as a journalist. He said, how is it that all of you, because he was accused there was these multiple train blasts in Mumbai in 2006. He was accused of that. So he said, the reason why they were able to put me away was because journalists refused to do their job. And he said that, do you think if I was a terrorist and the police made this whole charge up about me, they said in their charge sheet that they arrested me and, I was a part of this huge terror gang. He said, do you think I would have been going every day to the police station for questioning if I was really a terrorist, if I was actually the person behind the bomb blast? Would I sit there in my house waiting to be arrested? And I was like, of course not. So he's like, why is it at that time that when they arrested us, journalists didn't ask those basic questions? And the answer to that is that we didn't know this. We didn't have access to they hide the fact, because they have privacy. They can say that it's an ongoing investigation. We can't share information with you. So we didn't know the exact circumstances or who these people were who were accused of terror. So we didn't have that information, but we didn't ask the right questions as well. We didn't ask enough questions. I wanted to ask you, David, because I saw in the film how they, basically it's all of you who are reporters and journalists like us. Is it very difficult? Does it require special investigative skills for a reporter to pick holes in a police theory? Is it better once you have the full picture, once the conviction is done? Or is it something that you can be a watchdog right from the beginning, from the time that the case, someone's arrested? Or do you have to wait to see the full picture in order to know or, act as a kind of watchdog against the police and call them out?
Well, you have to pick your own battles, I suppose, is the answer. You can't possibly, as a journalistic organization or as an investigating firm, monitor every case. thousands and thousands. So if you decide to focus on one case, and clearly they should have focused on this one man in Mumbai, and for whatever reason they didn't, because presumably there was no red flags out there suggesting they should be investigating him in particular. But once you know what you're looking at, then you go right back to the beginning and start peeling away every layer, and it's a very systematic, intense, careful, meticulous process. I think one of the things you're getting at, what was partly in your question there, was, is there something special about private investigators versus journalists in terms of what we can get at? And the answer is yes and no. I've discovered in my new job that there are a lot of tools that are available in the US, at least, to every journalist that I didn't realize I had access to. I've learned so much about, filing Freedom of Information Act FOIA requests, which basically, in the US at least, if you ask the government for something, they have to give it to you, even if occasionally they're redacted. That's what the Freedom of Information Act does in the United States. And I think a lot of journalists don't understand that those resources are available to them. And also we have a tremendous number of websites we can go to track people, to find out where people are, where they're living, some of which are available to journalists and some of which are only available to private investigators. So we have access to data online that ordinary journalists do not. We're audited every time we use it. For example, I can go to New York State and look at people's driving license records, some of their records, not all of them, and it varies from state by state. And we have tools to find out where those police officers were living that you as a journalist, if you were in America, would not have access to. So actually it's true that in some cases private investigators simply have better skills and better tools to do the kind of work that would take journalists much longer if they could do it at all.
Well, the revelation is the use of private investigators. I'm sure that defense lawyers in India as well use them, but it's something that it's not as out in the open as it is in the US. I mean, and also, actually, coming down to a technical point, you found this police officer who had a completely different version that, went contrary to what the prosecution had claimed in court. Then you got an affidavit done. Is that something that there was, did that have legal weightage? Did you have to take him to the court and get it done, or is it something that
we frequently ask witnesses in cases. When I'm interviewing witnesses, I'm doing this big Me Too thing at the moment. I will say to them, also another exoneration case I'm doing. At the very outset, I'll say, if you can help me on this, I will ask you two things. One is, would you be willing to sign an affidavit? And I can do that. I don't need to have a lawyer present. And sometimes I say to them, it may be that it'll be useful in this case for you to talk to journalists. Sometimes clients will come to us and say, okay, please find out what we all need to know about what this company has done wrong, or why this person shouldn't be in jail, or that kind of thing. And they will say, what are we going to do with the information when you find it for us? Do we go to the Justice Department? Do we go to the police? Or do we actually go to my old community, the journalists? And that we often do. So we have very close relationships with, friends on the New York Times, the New Yorker, and it's not as if we're planting stories with them, but we do approach them and say, look, we think this is important. This is what we have. Go run with it. And we expect them to do more work and to corroborate. We don't expect them just to say, oh, thank you, and type it out like a press release. But so sometimes I'll say to witnesses, this Me Too thing is really heart-wrenching. I've spoken to women in the United States, all across the United States in this case, and the stories that they have told me of what has happened to them in the workplace is really tears your heart out. And then I say to them, would you be happy talking to the press about this? And you can see the women are like, hard. Obviously, it's hard enough to...
I'm just curious, who's funding, who wants you all to find out about Me Too people?
In this case, it's a union. So a union that is...
That's noble then.
Well, yes and no. In the case, the company that's involved resists unionization of workers. So the union has an interest in giving this company trouble. But they're good people, and they care about Me Too. But anyway, so sometimes, if it's not an affidavit, which you mentioned, sometimes it's saying to people, would you be willing to talk to the press? And what's amazing to me, two things that amaze me as a journalist and as an investigator, and I don't know whether this would apply in India, but it certainly applies in America, is I cannot believe how often people are willing to speak with me. And I cannot believe how people who've sometimes been through terrible experiences understand the greater importance of what we're doing in a particular case, and they swallow hard and say, yes, I will talk to the press because I know it's important. And that really is impressive to me.
Reggie, what happened to Reggie?
Reggie's preaching the gospel in Orlando. I don't know if anyone else wanted to have...
Yeah, that's what, yeah. Does anyone have any questions?
Since you were mentioning, both of you mentioned alternatives to funding that we haven't received, like journalistic expeditions that you said don't necessarily fund these things that we do to create awareness, and the awareness campaigns in India, which is the limit to where it goes in terms of these kind of cases. Where do you think, and I'm asking this as an aspiring journalist myself, will we stop making journalistic sacrifices and finding alternatives to funding, finding alternatives to creating awareness and making these sacrifices in journalism itself? And where do you think this line will be drawn to gain a sense of genuine emancipation without going ahead and doing all of these things as alternatives?
That sounds like a cry from the heart.
He's a young student, David.
No, I mean, all I would say is keep faith, keep the faith, because it's so important. Everyone hardly needs saying that journalism, for lots of reasons, is in something of a crisis right now, a credibility crisis, partly because there are some bad actors in journalism and there are some bad actors in private investigating also. We have to be aware of that. We had a panel discussion yesterday about fake news, which was fascinating. So many challenges, but at the same time, the importance of the work that I hope you will continue to do, it becomes more important. Look at what's happening in the United States with the attacks on the free press by our fine president, which we won't get into. And I think, that we have heard from a number of speakers here these 2 days of trying to find a model to do what you're asking, which is, where journalism doesn't have to be a personal sacrifice, that you're doing something important, but it has the proper funding. And I think that there is a really concerted effort. I mentioned philanthropists. I don't know whether India is a country of philanthropists in the way the United States is. I come from the UK originally, and the philanthropy industry in the UK is really nothing like it is in the US, partly because in the UK, and I suspect this is probably true in India, has more of a tradition of government support for things, whether it's healthcare or education, which never really existed in the United States. So there's a very healthy philanthropy complex, if you like, in the United States. And part of what I said earlier, I think, is making those people aware of their responsibility. And, it's happening. The Washington Post was on its knees 10 years ago, and Jeff Bezos bought it. And whatever you think about Amazon, which we've just been watching, the Washington Post is now a fantastically agile and successful. So I think I hope there's just enough people in civil society who understand what losing a really vibrant press would mean for society. It would be a disaster in so many ways. And one of the reasons that I'm here in these 2 days is that I hope that collaboration between private investigating and our ability to bring money to the table is something that we can also explore. And again, I'll be talking more about that this afternoon, I think at 4:30 or so.
I just wanted to add to that by saying that, philanthropy hasn't really taken off in India that much. However, what I think is, if we find as journalists, what we can do is, and there are lots of forms of storytelling now, if we find a way of making a story compelling, then there are various modes of expressing it. And that's what we should aim for, really, to just say it in a way. And, Netflix and all of these kind of things, they're telling those stories now. And I think we are seeing all those outlets. They want stories, and so that's a great way for us to take out all these stories which might not find its way in the usual daily, everyday mainstream media or even the websites. So you find those ways of telling their story.
Part of the problem, of course, sometimes is, are people paying attention? We can write. One of the reasons I switched from journalism is I was under so much pressure because of clicks to write almost exclusively about Donald Trump, and discovering at the same time that the people I was trying to get to, in other words, the people who love him, were just paying no attention whatsoever. And I was preaching to a choir that was already converted. So you kind of, at some point, that was a bit discouraging. There's something funny going on in the United States at the moment with the polarization of politics, where, Donald Trump himself said it when he said he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and his supporters wouldn't care. So if that's true, what can I do as a writer to make them care? Probably not much. But anyway, I don't mean to discourage you, but that's another question about how do you get people's attention? And that's why something like the series that we saw just now, again, is important, because that free Meek series will get a lot of attention. It's already getting some terrific reviews, and people will watch it. Or recently, the case on Netflix of the Central Park 5 got an enormous reaction in the US, and people who were responsible for putting those men away, all these years later, are now being forced out of their jobs, off corporate boards, off university boards. It's taken one show on Netflix to make that difference.
I know that people might have questions. You should go for David's second session in the afternoon, because we're totally out of time. Thank you, David.
Thank you.